Hello, everybody. Today, we are honored to have a conversation with Nicholas Kristof, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a best-selling author, and an unflinching advocate for the underrepresented. Over many decades, Nick has reported on some of the world's most challenging issues, from genocide and trafficking to inequality and political divides. His reporting has not only informed, but has inspired countless readers to care more deeply about the world around them. We're here to dive in and explore what drives him, as well as some of his views on the media and how things are changing in this part of the world. And we're going to talk about his experiences on the front lines, literally. It's the perfect, Nicholas, I think you're the perfect person to come on Notes from the Front. Just, I don't know if I've actually told you this, but the vision for Notes from the Front podcast is to feature people who are fighting to make the world a better place. And if anything came through in your most recent book that you read, or that you wrote, that I read, which is Chasing Hope, it's about how you really do see the role of journalism as being one in which you can have an impact on the world. And so I'm truly honored to have you here. Thank you so much for joining, and
Thank you.
welcome.
Thank you, Michelle. I spent a lot of time, tilting at windmills, and if you tilted enough windmills, occasionally you hit one.
I don't even know what that phrase means, tilting at window. I have heard this so many times. How would you describe that?
It was Don Quixote thinking that the windmills was it dragons? And he was charging at them on his horse, and that was tilting at windmills.
Okay. I actually have read that book, but I forgot. And I just am remembering that reference. And that book, actually, I loved. I've been thinking about rereading it, but it's very long. My biggest takeaway from that book is if you do, I think the biggest takeaway was something like, if you try to do the same thing over and over and over again, you go a little crazy.
So that I don't.
That was
all I remember is poor Don Quixote tilting at windmills and kind of inspiring me to, on my little quixotic ventures of my own.
All right. I got to reread the book. Well, all right. So where to begin here? I have so many questions for you, and I hesitate to start with something around your childhood, but I actually think in this case that is a good place to start because, if there's one thing. So first of all, let me just say I've been reading your work since I was in high school. I remember
Well, you're
reading your
dating me,
pieces.
Michelle.
Yes, and me, I guess too. I remember reading your pieces. I feel like growing up in my household, we had these like years where we'd have to bring current events to the dinner table and talk about them. And like, I remember bringing some of your pieces to the dinner table. So you've been out there for decades covering stories that probably the vast majority of people in the world would not want to cover, let alone even be in the country that you were in. You went off to Cambodia and covered sex trafficking, and you're in Sudan and covering genocide. If you were to map to your earliest part of your life that you can remember, where did you develop this calling to dig into these difficult topics? And where did you develop this empathy that has served you in being able to report on such difficult topics?
So my dad was a World War II refugee, and the family had spied on the Nazis, had been caught. Some family members were executed by the Nazis, others by the Soviet communists. And so, from when I was very, very young, I was acutely aware of the costs of oppression. And, my dad's life was spared because of the intervention of a French diplomat. So, acutely aware that one can make a real difference. But I've still got to say that, when I joined the New York Times originally, I was covering international economics. It wasn't as if I was covering these kinds of issues right from the start. And to some degree, it was accidental. And, I've written a lot about sex trafficking, and that began because I did one piece back in maybe 1996, perhaps. I met these young teenage girls who had been kidnapped and were being sold for their virginity. And it felt just like slavery, except these girls were being dead of AIDS by their early 20s. And it's just very hard to to leave and then go back to covering exchange rates. Likewise, I made one trip to Darfur and, thought that would be it. And then again, you just can't get out of your mind when people are being massacred and bodies stuffed in wells to destroy the wells. You feel you have to fight back. And in my case, I can't fight back with a gun, but I fight back with my laptop and my camera.
Yeah. What is that phrase? The pen is mightier than the sword.
Yeah. It's not always true, at least in the short run. I mean, I've seen, unfortunately, too many writers arrested and, occasionally killed. But the pen or the keyboard does have a certain amount of might to raise the costs to government of this kind of brutality, of genocide, of massacres. And it's a tool I have.
Right. So, okay, just to dig in a little deeper on that. So you wrote this piece. Was this before or after you had already been in China covering Tiananmen
The,
Square?
the human trafficking piece, it was afterward.
Mhm.
And
After, okay.
that was a real wake up call too, to be at Tiananmen Square and see a government use weapons of war against pro-democracy students. That shakes you up, especially when you're in the crowd that they're firing on. And it was both terrifying, but also just so appalling and outrageous. And so, that I think was one step in this evolution.
Right. So yeah, I mean the scenes about that in your book were extraordinary. Just I think there was a scene where someone's like being wheeled away and saying "Tell the world."
Yeah.
Is that correct? Some
Yeah.
from that
That was,
moment, right?
that kind of, that he was a worker who was a rickshaw driver. And I had been, it nags at me because frankly, I had been a little bit scornful perhaps of the peasants and workers in the democracy movement back then in 1989. And I wrote a few times that, well, they say they're for democracy, but they can't really define the democracy they're in favor of. They can't describe the institutions that they would create. And, all that was right. But that terrible night when the troops opened fire, it was those uneducated workers and peasants who were the real heroes. And that that guy was this rickshaw driver. And when there was a lull in the firing, he pedaled his rickshaw out toward the soldiers to this, no man's land between us and the troops. And he picked up the bodies of the kids who'd been killed and injured. And then he rushed them to the hospital, and he had body of a kid on the back of his rickshaw. And he saw me as a foreigner. He evidently knew I was a reporter, and he, came by, and he had just had tears streaming down his cheeks, and he shouted at me, "Tell the world." And that he may not have been able to define democracy, but he was willing to risk his life for it. And that, the same, sort of a similar thing that night, there was the convoys of troops were coming into Beijing to massacre the students. And there was a bus driver on the old airport road who drove his bus across the road to block the convoy. And he just gotten it across. He turned the engine off. He had the key in his hand, and he stepped out of the bus. And the convoy soldiers had to stop. An officer got out of the lead truck and shouted at him, "Move the bus." And he said, "No." And the officer pointed his sidearm at the bus driver. And this is this salt at the earth bus driver. He didn't have any, I doubt if he had read anything about democratic theory, but he said no. And then he took the keys to the bus that were in his hand, and he hurled them off into the grassy verge beside the road. It was high grass. It was at night. They weren't going to find those keys that night. And, just raw courage. And I think sometimes about the way we in this country take for granted the democratic institutions that we have inherited. And I wish we could show the same respect for democracy that those Chinese peasants showed that terrible night.
So it's okay. So if I'm reading this correctly, it sounds like what sort of started as, oh, it would be exciting to go abroad and be paid to travel and talk to people. It was sort of while abroad that all of a sudden you started seeing the impact you could have as a writer. And then it came to be more of a, I can't not do this. Like, this is
Yeah.
like, I
I
feel
think that's
called to do this work.
I think that's largely right. I mean, I think I always had a bit of a interest in, kind of social justice issues because of my dad's history. But
Mhm.
I could well have ended up just covering exchange rates or whatever it might be. And it was a function of these stories that I wrote that really pushed me in that direction to write more about trafficking, about genocide, about human rights, about women's rights, that kind of thing.
Mhm. How did you pick those topics? Like, that was something else that was curious I was thinking about a lot while reading your book is, you talked a couple times about how frustrating it is when people don't care about something that you care about. And that resonated a lot for me because there's things I care about that I wished other people cared about more. Then I was thinking, there are topics you care about, and then there's topics that you don't cover in your writing. How did you get drawn to trafficking and genocide and women's rights and what other issues, like if you could have duplicated yourself, what other issues would have you covered? Or what do you think you should have covered more of? Like how do you think about that? What to care about, I guess, is the question.
So I guess I'm looking in part for issues where I can make a difference. And I think there's sometimes a misperception that as journalists, as a columnist, that I'm changing people's minds on issues. And, the truth is that if I write about Donald Trump, if I write about guns, if I write about abortion, then I don't really change anybody's mind. People who start out agreeing with me think, oh, great column. People who start out disagreeing think, Christoph completely missed the boat again. And where I think we do have an impact, whether we're columnists or whether we're just regular writers, is really in the ability to project an issue onto the agenda and force people to confront it. And, when people think about 13-year-old girls who've been trafficked and are locked in a brothel and are being raped all day, then you know, nobody is arguing, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's just manifest that this is a bad thing, that we should do something about it. Likewise, genocide in Darfur, that once you hear the stories, that's the first step towards some progress. So I look for those kinds of issues that I think can move people if I could just get those stories and bring them to the public. And I think I also try to look for stories that, in part, um, are neglected but have a moral element to them. And I always think that we are at our worst in developing public policy toward issues that are hard to talk about. I spent a lot of time writing about AIDS, and it was just so clear that millions of people died unnecessarily of AIDS because, in part, it was sexually transmitted, often men having sex with men. And that just, it was really hard to have honest conversations about that. And so people died. And likewise, I think mental health is something that is hard for people to talk about. Addiction, and domestic violence. And so I try to tackle some of these taboos and write about them. Um, but again, there's just a lot of, just a kind of a quirky personal element to it because I'm from a part of rural Oregon that has just been through the ringer. And I've had a lot of friends who have died from addiction. So it's a matter that, resonates with me. And I think that educated Americans have often not faced the struggles in working class America, don't understand them. And so you know, I can fight back, I can push back. I would also say that I, I tend to be liberal on most issues, and so when I write my standard, piece critical of Donald Trump, for example, I don't really change any conservatives' minds because they sort of expect that I'm going to be wrong. But where I think that I do have an impact is where I unusually take a more conservative stance on something, because then liberals will hear me out. And they may think, well, he's wrong today. But they don't think that I'm evil. They don't think I'm a sucker for corporate America. And so I disproportionately look for areas where I can not win applause from my base, but kind of provoke them and force them to think in new ways and hold an idea up to the light. And I think that aggravates a lot of my readers and fans, but I do think that's how people change minds. And I want to confront people who normally agree with me with things that maybe don't fit into their narrative.
That's so interesting. Oh my gosh, I have so many questions coming out of that. I do for sure want to talk about working class America. So I'm going to put that in the parking lot for now.
Okay.
Um, and I also think that this taking a more conservative stance that's a very interesting, unexpected comment from you, which I definitely want to get back to. Before we move on from this topic entirely, are there any have you had any conflict with the New York Times about what you want to cover, or with your wife? I mean, when you're saying, I want to go back to Darfur, I want to go back to Darfur, is anyone saying like, this is too expensive or too risky, or like, actually, can you cover this? Like, we're not covering Latin America enough. Like, how did
So,
do you just get
so
to cover whatever you want? Or
So, when I was a reporter in the newsroom, then, I was dispatched to cover this or that. As a columnist, I've had, almost full freedom. And, God bless the New York Times. They never said, oh, you want to make another trip to Darfur and write more columns that nobody will read and they're incredibly expensive and dangerous. Um, and so fortunately they did not do that. And I was at a stage in my career when I was willing to write columns that nobody read. And so I have a great deal of freedom about what to write. In recent years, over about the last 10 years, there has been more concern about journalist safety. And
Mhm.
so the pushback when I've had it has not been about you're spending too much money, but has been about, what are the risks? Um, how, is it worth it? And uh, that I think a lot of the veterans like me, on the one hand, we tend to kind of roll our eyes at that. On the other hand, I've lost friends who took risks that maybe weren't entirely worth it. And the first time the New York Times sent a security advisor with me was when I went into Syria, and they limited my trip. I just went into a little bit of northern Syria and then back out to Turkey. And I felt a little muzzled and constrained. And then shortly after that, the kidnappings of journalists began in Syria. And, at that point, I wanted to hug my security consultant. And boy, my wife did too. So, um, you know, the real constraint has been on the security side, and that's probably a good thing.
Mhm. Do you usually go in with a team? Like, when you go somewhere dangerous, how many people go?
So, sometimes it's just me. When I was just on the Sudan-Chad border, and that was just me. Sometimes I have a photographer with me or a video journalist. Um, and then, typically I find a interpreter on the scene, and then there's a local driver. And so I'm always very conscious that when I'm in some problematic place, that frankly, I have a certain amount of value, if you will, even as just a kidnapping target, but my driver and my interpreter don't. And it is a lower pay grade decision for just some random soldier to execute them, where it's probably a higher pay grade decision to do something terrible to me. And so you know, I'm very concerned about the safety of the local people I work with, and not to put them in some terrible position where, because I'm paying them a fair amount of money in local terms, that then they take risks that they're unhappy with, and trying to gauge that and figure out what risks are worthwhile to get a story, and how you weigh that against my safety and not wanting my wife to get a terrible phone call, and, my concern for my driver and interpreter. All that's just, they're very difficult trade-offs and decisions that have to be made. But in general, I've tried to be more prudent as time has gone on, partly because I've seen how badly things can go, and partly because my wife has kind of successfully worked on me to be more careful.
Mhm. Mhm. I saw a clip from your work from a couple months ago that looked like you were just holding your phone. You had been speaking with a woman who talked about seeing all her brothers killed. I
Yeah,
think she had been raped. Uh, she's crying. You were holding your phone out and saying, I just talked to this woman and she asked, she told me this story and ended it by saying, "Are we not human?"
yeah,
And I think I saw tears in your eyes. Like, definitely you looked
yeah,
like you were welling up. It was an extremely powerful video, and I just thought, sort of extraordinary. You're there with your iPhone, like, how much has changed from the past.
yeah.
Um
And I mean, that was an incredible woman. Her name was Naima Adam. She, she her brothers had been killed. Um, her her 10-year-old son, the militia had tried to kill him. She tried to make him look like he was a little baby by putting him on her back, and then they were still gonna kill him. They were trying to grab at him, and she refused to give him up. And then they shot her twice, and she still refused to give him up. And and she saved his life. And then they fled. And then the next place she went, the militia came and they wanted to rape her niece, and she said, "Don't rape her, rape me." And then she fought off the guys. And I mean, this just raw courage. And, on the one hand, it's terrible, Michelle, and just the things you hear and see, it just underscores that evil is still a real presence in the world. On the other hand, you see a woman like Naima and her courage and tenacity and resilience and strength and just goodness. I mean, she's a saint. She's a hero. I just find that, utterly inspiring. And I, it's an honor to tell the story of somebody like Naima.
Something that I found myself thinking while reading your book was about how I think it does seem you are drawn to cover evil and and shine a light on it. They say that, what is that? Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Yeah.
Um, and I, especially in some of the reporting on what was going on in Darfur, I found myself wondering, I'm like, is there another side to this story? Like, was this a war? Like, how could people be so evil? How could people go into villages and just like rape all the women and kill all the men? Like, did someone do something to them first? Like, and I think you touch on a lot of points about the sort of feeling a slight discomfort at, have I become an activist? Like, I think you even at one point, I gotta get the quote here. Um, you said something like, am I wielding power to have impact on a genocide? Where was it? Oh, you said, but in my heart, I wondered whether my drive to get to dangerous places in Darfur was entirely high minded or whether it was in part shaped by a reckless pursuit of glory. Was I breaching journalistic ethics and protocol by investing too much of myself in this story? I was exerting power to advance my own goal of ending a genocide. Um,
Yeah.
can you speak more on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there were two things that I worried about. I mean, one was um, this pursuit. Am I pursuing glory and Pulitzer prizes uh, in ways that that are unfair to my wife and three kids, and putting you know risking my life in ways that would be catastrophic for them. And the other thing was this question of activism and what is the role for a journalist in covering a genocide like that? And, to what extent are we supposed to be on the sidelines, taking notes and reporting versus, really pushing, I mean, I was just outraged at what I saw. I joined one meeting with the Secretary General of the UN, and I wondered. It wasn't an interview. And I kind of wondered, should I be really doing this? I didn't. I did a lot of public speaking about Darfur. I didn't join the rallies, and that was kind of the distinction that I made. But but I wondered if I was becoming an activist rather than a journalist. And when I felt I was skating really close to the edge, I sort of convinced myself that, well, if you're going to cross some lines, then doing so to oppose a genocide is probably about as good an excuse as there is. But it, you know, I was pretty close to the line. I think some of my colleagues thought I probably crossed those lines.
One of the biggest critiques of journalists today is that they are too activist and that there isn't enough balance in journalism. And the New York Times is taking a ton of heat. I mean, I've been a lifelong reader of the New York Times. I actually just subscribed recently. I was like, I'm going to become my own subscriber. I was like, you know what? I really appreciate the work this organization is doing, even though, so many people around me are canceling. I have a lot of friends who've canceled the New York Times subscription the past year because they're, unhappy about its reporting on various topics. Maybe we don't need to talk about the Times, but can we talk about activism and journalism and like where is the line and how do you guide young journalists today, and especially in like the world of social media and where there's so much pressure to drive numbers and sort of rage bait and all this. Like how do
Well, I
you
think,
think about this and guide people on this?
yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things going on. Um, One is that the business model for journalism has collapsed. And so everybody is more attuned to metrics about audience than they used to be. And we also have better metrics. We didn't really used to know who was reading our stories. Now everybody knows,
Mhm.
how many page views we get, how many people are watching a cable television segment. And then also, I think for individual journalists, there's a sense that it is good for your career to have an individual brand. And that one way you develop that brand is having opinions and going on TV and expressing those opinions. And, in the columnist role, it used to be that the columnists all had kind of my background, which was that of spending years or decades reporting and then becoming columnists. Now, I think more and more people are coming from the opinion world, and they're very good at expressing opinions, and then they move into the columnist role. So I think the returns of being an opinion journalist have increased. And I also think that in newsrooms around the country, um, I think my generation has more of a view that we should, um, you know, quote people on all sides, cover people, and then the truth will emerge, and people will decide. And um, I would acknowledge that that's imperfect, and that I think that model didn't really work covering Donald Trump very well. And it didn't work with Joe McCarthy. It didn't work with civil rights. But in general, I'm a believer in um, quoting people I disagree with and following people on Twitter I disagree with and reading news sources that I disagree with and in publishing opinions that I disagree with. And I think there are a lot of young journalists who just kind of disagree with that and think that opinions, matter, and that when you publish a wrong opinion or a harmful opinion, then it can cost lives. And so they take a very different view and are much less inclined to have this broad range of opinions that I find central to the journalism model. There's, I think, an ongoing debate about that in journalism.
Hmm. What do you read to follow the other side?
It's sort of funny with the
I wanted to ask you that actually. That was one of my questions, but
well,
I mean, you are, from what I can tell, a like what's the bleeding heart liberal, right? Is that the term?
yeah. Um, well, uh, so Michelle, like every morning, I go for a run around our vineyard here, and I do that even though it's painful and it makes me sweat, but I think it makes a better me. And in the same vein,
Mhm.
every morning I read the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and it's painful and it makes me sweat, but I think it makes a better me. Um, and on I follow a lot of people on social media who I disagree with. I reach out to people before I write a column who I will disagree with, and that's really important because we all have these cognitive biases, and we tend to have our narratives and reject parts of the, little information bits that don't fit into that. And so, so I'm a bleeding heart liberal on international issues, and my colleague Brett Stevens is, a conservative on and hawkish on many international security issues. And I learn, you know, I make it a priority to read Brett more than almost any other person because he is going to force me to face little bits and pieces that don't fit into my narrative. And he's gonna, you know, there are going to be lots of things that just, don't fit in. In the Middle East, context, he's written a lot about Palestinian incitement, which doesn't fit into my narrative, and he forces me to confront that, and it's a real issue. And so I, and I think I'm probably forcing him to confront bits that don't fit into his narrative, and that's good. That's how we fight our biases, how we become more agile intellectually, less dogmatic, less ideological, and I hope more pragmatic.
I love that. I also have been recently reading the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and finding it very refreshing in certain ways, especially compared to Twitter. Okay, you also mentioned that you follow people you don't agree with on social media. And I would like to just briefly touch on the fact that you have a very active Twitter account. I believe you have tweeted 56,000 times, something like that. It's a lot.
It's cool.
Um, and granted, you were on Twitter early. I know you were one of the early people on Twitter, but and you have a big following there, 2 million followers. So you have a very big platform. I mean, from what I can tell right now, a lot of probably your colleagues are leaving Twitter, or sorry, X, and saying, I think I saw that you were on Kara Swisher's podcast a couple months ago. I think she's referring to it as a Nazi porn site, I've heard. Wh- how do you tell people, like, how do you explain the fact that you're on X and active and engaged on X, and fighting the good fight on X? I think even you got in some big controversy this week about abortion.
Yeah.
um yeah. I saw that go down. How do you think about being on this platform when so many of your fellow liberals are fleeing
So, I think it's true that Twitter has become more toxic, more of a kind of just a nasty sewer, and I, I'm not. I'm much less focused on replies and things like that in the conversations. I think it's become less useful for conversations, but because I'm interested a lot in a lot of international issues. There are a lot of people internationally who are on Twitter and are great news sources, who are in locations that don't get covered. And if I want to understand what is happening in different points of view, I find it really good for that. So I don't, I think it's true that the kind of conversation part of it has become less important, but just following independent, news sources to get stories that don't make the news. I think that's quite useful. And one of the things I do try to use Twitter for is to call attention to um, stories or retweet pieces that I think it'd be useful if more people knew about it. It's hard to get interest in Myanmar, but I can RT a tweet from Myanmar, and maybe at least a dozen people will see it.
I love that. Yeah, and I mean, frankly, people talk about, "Oh, Twitter's so awful. I can't go there for my mental health." Sorry, I also have said things like that before, so I'm not trying to be too patronizing, but part of me, I'm reading your book, like, you're talking about you're out there and getting shot at, and I'm like, "All right, well, if he can get shot at with physical bullets, I bet he can handle the mob on Twitter.
Yeah.
Like, give me a break."
Yeah. And look, I dish it out. I've got to be willing to take it. Um, that's kind of the bottom line.
Uh-huh. What do you think about the fact that so many people are getting their news there, though? And the fact that now, I mean, a lot has changed since when you first became a journalist. I think my sense of things is when you became a journalist, like if you wanted millions of people to read your work and you had this urge to get your writing into the world, you sort of needed to join a platform that printed things on paper. And like there were actual physical costs to printing and distributing to millions. Now anyone can become, in a sense, a citizen journalist. I put that in quotations. People can just start a Substack. You can tweet. You can TikTok. I mean, a lot of the coverage of global catastrophes is now on TikTok. I'm seeing like teenage girls in Gaza sharing what's going on, and it is dramatically changing the way that people consume news, opinion, information, etcetera. Do you wanna talk about that at all? Like,
Yeah.
there's real cost to this and having people that aren't trained, don't have sort of like ethical standards or fact checking, right?
Yeah. I mean,
It's very different.
I have kind of complicated views, about that. And, um, on I think one of the problems is, again, our cognitive biases. And the truth is that as human beings, we don't want the most accurate, independent news. We want information that will confirm our biases. That's true whether we're on the left or the right. There was one kind of landmark study back in the 1960s that sent people mailings and offered them free literature. And some of it, was geared to the left, some to the right. And, basically, if you registered Democrats wanted what they most wanted, and it was Republicans were the same, but everybody most wanted was information that made the other side look stupid. What they next wanted
Mm.
is information that made their side look good. And what they least wanted to read was, smart, intelligent news sources, credible sources that would undermine their position. And I think
Mhm.
fundamentally that's still where we are. And now with social media, we can all enter an ecosystem where we're fed a constant diet of pieces saying how the other side is all idiots and how we're brilliant and right. And I think that's really unfortunate, and it's overlain by a tendency for liberals to live near other liberals and conservatives to live near other conservatives. Um, and I find that problematic. And in social media, it's complicated because a lot of it is, as you suggest, not terribly accurate. I started out really being kind of pro Facebook. I thought it would knit people together and um, help deal with loneliness, et cetera. And then I was in Myanmar covering the genocide against the Rohingya, and I was in a village where the Rohingya had just been massacred. And I talked to one of the Rakhine people who had been doing the massacring, and I asked why they had killed all their Rohingya neighbors. And he said, well, they read on Facebook how a Rohingya boy had raped this Rakhine girl. And so, what could we do? We had to go attack them. And so we talked about that a little more. And they said later, what happened to that Rakhine girl who was raped? And he said, oh, actually, that turned out not to be true. But, at that point, we'd already massacred them. And, that was an extreme example, but I think that at some level, there is a certain amount of that. Now, conversely, social media has been really effective in some ways. And, we are still getting news out of Myanmar from Twitter, for example, or Facebook. And during the Syrian civil war, it was quite useful to have people be able to document brutality and post it. In Sudan right now, the just horrible atrocities underway. And, Twitter helps hold people accountable. And so, it has its uses, but does it make everything more toxic? Does it spread false conspiracy theories? Does it make it harder to have a shared vocabulary in this country? A shared knowledge base? Absolutely.
Yeah, the accountability side is very interesting to me. This community notes feature is just exploding. It's like every post now from a politician has community notes attached to it. I think that was your scandal from yesterday. You shared some story about a woman who had wanted to abort her child, and then it turns out like all the community notes against it were astounding. It's like she was a meth user, and it was the 7th month, and it left. I don't know if we need to get too deep into this, but what did happen with that post? Was the
So
story wrong, or was the community notes wrong? Like, how I didn't know what to
Well,
think. I was like,
I mean, both were fundamentally right. I mean, from my liberal point of view, the horrible thing was this woman in Nevada had a miscarriage and then was arrested and spent time in prison. So to me, that the lesson was just be very careful about folks who are from the kind of extreme pro-life end who are trying to enforce this very rigorous, point of view and willing to imprison somebody who has a miscarriage. And, I think that lesson holds. I think that was true. The community notes people pointed out also correctly that she had tried to have a miscarriage. She'd taken cinnamon and she thought that would induce a miscarriage. Apparently it didn't. Apparently the miscarriage was independent of that. And so from my point of view, that was irrelevant. From their point of view, it was, she had used meth. Again, that seemed not terribly relevant to me. It seemed very relevant to others. Mm-hmm. And this was before Roe v. Wade was overturned, also entirely true. But it was an interesting example where my tweet was right in making a point and directing people to this article, and people from the other side of the abortion debate, they saw it and they said, oh, but you didn't say she used meth. You didn't say that she wanted a miscarriage and so on. And that from their point of view, that was all relevant. So they thought they had a gotcha, and I didn't sense a gotcha at all.
Interesting. Okay, that's actually very clarifying. Yeah, you were all over the news. They're all over Twitter today. If there was totally a gotcha thing, it's like, we got this New York Times columnist. There is this I really do want to talk about polarization. And I actually think this is a good segue because this also seems like a transition you have gone through in that you are focusing more on issues closer to home. I mean, you ran for governor of Oregon because you wanted to focus on issues at home. And you wrote I'm now in the middle of another one of your books, Tightrope, which is about working class America. And this is something that I am finding myself to be very drawn to as a topic, polarization. And by the way, I'll just say up front, I blame the media in many ways for this. I really think that, and I read a book about this, Hate Inc. by Matt Taibbi, that was fantastic. And it just talked about how, as the business model of these newspapers have been just hammered by social media and online ads, and as the business models have fallen out, they've had to do more and more things to sort of drive rage and anger and fear and have become more and more extreme. And I don't know, maybe it's tempting to want to blame the media, but could you talk a little bit about sort of, you're, I don't like to use the word old, but you're old enough to remember a time when we weren't as polarized as a country, whereas I'm kind of not. Like my entire adult life, I think we've been pretty polarized. I don't have a concept of a moderate Republican and a moderate Democrat like sitting down and having a conversation about policy as like a normal thing. Can you talk a little bit about sort of working class, like what has happened in American politics where all of a sudden the working class is now Republican? Your view of that. I mean, you talk a lot about this in your book, how liberals sort of look down upon the working class and have become very like the elitism. How do you, as I know this is a very long question and I feel like I'm rambling, but I guess what I'm trying to ask is like, it seems like you can stand on both sides of this divide. You have friends who are conservatives. You read conservative content. You look for opportunities to challenge your own thinking. But it seems like the majority of the country is very much an echo chamber. Like, do you want to share some thoughts on this? I
Yeah.
think that was I don't think I did a good job at asking that question.
Well, first,
That was way too long.
I think I'd push back a little bit at
Sorry.
the thesis that I haven't read the Matt Taibbi book, but I think I'd push back at the idea that this was primarily driven by the media. And I would note that it's been a feature not just in the U.S., but really all over the Western world, where there has been where working class folks have been left behind and where there's been high levels of immigration that I think have left people feeling voiceless. You said I was old enough to remember the period pre-polarization, but I'm actually also old enough to remember as a little kid an era that was even more polarized. I was a kid during the Vietnam War, and that was a time when so many households were completely torn asunder, and kids were, they were doing everything wrong from their parents' point of view. They were against the Vietnam War, in some cases, dodging the draft. They were sleeping with boyfriends or girlfriends. They were using drugs. They were disrespectful. They had long hair. It was just this incredible cultural and generational conflict that I think was much greater than even than now. And I understand why working class Americans are angry. I mean, I think they have been screwed over, and I spent last time I looked was about 2 years ago, and at that point, weekly non-supervisory wages, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, were lower after adjusting for inflation than they'd been in 1981. That's just unbelievable. And so if you were like, we have sawmills around here in Oregon, and, it used to be that was a pretty good path to a middle-class life. And then those jobs just went away. And here in Oregon, we liberals opposed logging. And I think that was fundamentally the right decision. I think there was too much logging. It was not sustainable. It didn't care enough for the environment. But we cared more about the owls that were the endangered species we were trying to protect than we did about loggers and about logging families. And these communities, when the logging was ended, they just fell apart. and meth arrived, and then fentanyl arrived. Um, so I spent plenty of time in Iraq and Afghanistan, and those were important wars to cover. I'm glad I did, but every 2.5 weeks now, we lose more Americans to drugs, alcohol, and suicide than we lost in 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I don't think that Americans have adequately paid attention to just the heartbreak in so many homes around the country, and haven't addressed that adequately with a whole range of programs. I don't think we've addressed the educational mess, which is probably the best long-term way to try to lift the country up and lift these families up. So I think people have a right to be angry. I think it's unfortunate that resentment leads them to support Donald Trump. I think he's a charlatan. I think he's, uh, he's abusing that trust. But, if you've gone through all this, then, of course you want to blame somebody. Of course you are going to support somebody who promises he's going to bring the factory jobs back and solve the problems you face.
What do you make of the fact that the working class of America is not aligning with the Democratic Party at this point?
So
Like,
it, I mean, it's just this.
that's something.
It's a historic realignment. I mean, it's enormous, and it has happened so quickly. And I think that it, whoever wins this election, I think that Democrats need to look hard at how close it was. I think if it had been another Republican nominee, that person, it wouldn't have been close. That person would have been 10 points ahead of Kamala Harris. The fact that you had a convicted felon who ran an even race with, the Democratic vice president strikes me as something that Democrats should think a lot about. Likewise, for almost all of my adult life, people have identified more with Democrats in polls than with Republicans. Gallup says, I think, back to 1992. And now, for the first time, more Americans identify with the Republican Party than with the Democratic Party, according to Gallup. And so I think that there's a lot for Democrats to think about and worry about. And I think that they, haven't thought enough about working class Americans, and that when they have, too often it's come across as being, I don't know, a little condescending. That the issues that they've raised have tended to be ones that working class Americans are less focused on. And I'm very conflicted on immigration because Trump's policies pushed me, like many liberals, to the left. I mean, the child separation I thought was just horrific. And so that pushed me to the left on immigration, as I think it did a lot of people. But one thing that working class Americans and working class Europeans have been saying for years is we want less immigration. And we did not listen to them until, Biden finally did this summer in, I guess, June. But, and I think Democrats are being punished for that. So, and finally, I'd mention faith, that I think there has been a tendency among educated Americans to look down on people of faith and sometimes mock that faith, which is one of the central pillars for an awful lot of Americans. And no, that's not a very effective way to win their votes. Then there've been an awful lot of Democrats who have argued that every Trump voter is a racist and a bigot. And it's pretty hard to win votes of people you're accusing of being racist and bigots.
Oh, yeah. All right. So, okay, I agree with everything. And by the way, I'm also very conflicted on immigration. I mean, 3 of my 4 grandparents escaped the Holocaust and came to America. I know your story of your dad was extraordinary, kept coming here. So when you're so close to immigrant family, yeah, how can you not be conflicted when you see so many people coming here for a better life? With that said, I also am very uncomfortable with the idea of us not knowing who's in our country. I'm in New York. We have a lot of migrants here, and there's a lot of crime in New York. And so it's very natural to be concerned for, like, who are these people? Um, so I'm very torn on it as well. Okay, putting that issue aside, if you were to identify a few issues on the left that you disagree with, what would some of those issues be? Like, where do you feel most comfortable critiquing the Dems right now?
So, I mean, I think it would be kind of broad issues to address um, the working class crisis. I think there's been a failure to um, adequately address addiction. And, uh, education is an issue that really troubles me. And I think that both parties have just dropped the ball on it. One of the things that I've seen over my career is that the best path to help people out of poverty, whether you're talking about Zimbabwe or New York, is a better education. And if you try to explain how the US has the largest economy in the world, how we became the superpower, it's largely because we really pioneered mass education. We were the first country to have almost universal literacy, almost universal primary education, then the first country to have very widespread high schools, the first country to have widespread tertiary education. We had the highest high school graduation rates in the world in the 1960s. And since then, so many countries have passed us. And, right now we have this just, it seems to me, ridiculous debate in the US about education that is focused about, um, you know, critical legal theory in schools or book banning. And I think what we need to be focused on is getting kids literate and getting them numerate. And I think that early childhood education would help a lot. Getting kids to graduate, getting them on some kind of a path after graduation so that they can uh, either go to college or get some kind of a skill or join the military, but something after that. And I think we've bumbled that. I was One of the things that the Biden administration really fumbled was FAFSA, the financial aid forms that they rolled out, and it got almost no attention. But but the upshot was that there are fewer kids going to college this fall than there were a year ago, and that is just a tragedy. That was a huge failure, and I think I don't know why the Republicans didn't pounce on Biden for that and Harris for that. And a lot, school closures, the same thing. I mean, Republicans hugely screwed up during COVID by downplaying the threat of COVID, by skepticism about vaccines and vaccination. On the other hand, Democrats hugely screwed up by prolonged school closures that really hurt the most vulnerable kids. And so I think I think all sides can do a lot better. Housing is another issue. You can't walk through San Francisco or Portland and not understand that we have a basic problem building housing, and that the cost of housing is just a huge burden for the most vulnerable Americans.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with everything you just said. Although the one where I'm very torn, and I have actually, so this is episode 7 of Notes from the Front. 3 of the first 6 were on the methamphetamine crisis. So I interviewed, this has been an issue that I have spent a lot of time looking at, and I've read some of your work on. This seems to me like one of the areas where and every area you just mentioned, by the way, I think is an area where there could be tremendous bipartisan work together. Housing, like,
Yeah.
I think you even mentioned one of your articles that on the West Coast, we're more likely to be shouting housing is a human right, but they're more likely to actually build housing in Texas and Florida. On education it was the Democrats who kept kids out of school longer. Although, I mean, there's a lot more going on in education, but actually in San Francisco, we had all kinds of issues going on during pandemic with the school board where they were
Yeah.
just spending all this time changing the names of the
Giving
schools
these to
instead of trying to figure
schools
out how to
and
get kids on
wanting
laptops with
algebra.
internet.
Yeah.
And then canceling algebra, horrible. But the one area of the stuff is where, interestingly, the left and the right, the extreme left and the right, have agreed on this sort of live and let live approach to drugs. And I think it's the moderates who need to pull us out of that. Do you want to talk at all about what you think meth and fentanyl are doing in our country? I personally believe this is an enormous issue. And I've had a hard time actually in your book, when you talk about trying to get people to care about something, that I was thinking about the meth and fentanyl crisis, because I believe we have 100,000 people dying a year.
Yeah.
There's like 50 9/11s a year. And it feels like this isn't even showing up in our, day-to-day news cycle. And I guess I've thought about, like, why don't people care about this? I guess people don't view it as affecting them, but it feels to me like it's an enormous problem, not to mention all the brain damage that happens from overdoses that no one talks about at all. And just like the lives ruined by drug addiction, not to mention families, et cetera.
Yeah. I mean, it's, devastated so many families that I know, and people I care deeply about. A third of the kids on my old school bus are now gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And they were good, smart, capable kids, and they lost jobs, and then meth arrived, and they suffered greatly, but they also inflicted great suffering on others. And so, I think that part of the challenge is that now we have synthetic drugs, which are a lot harder to keep out. And the quantity, it's just so, such tiny amounts of money. It's really hard to stop it at the border, and the price, they're so cheap to make. It used to be that it cost $20 to get high. Now you can get high for
Right.
$2. That means that you have a lot of kids who can access it. And, and fentanyl especially is just so lethal. And so you get kids who trade pills. And, one of my 15-year-old neighbors, she took a pill that turned out to have fentanyl in it, and she's dead now. And behind, fentanyl was so much worse than heroin. Well, now we have nitazene, which is the next drug coming along, which is 10 or 20 times more potent than fentanyl. And, after that, there'll be something else. We have xylazine. I mean, there are just so many of these synthetic drugs that I think are going to make the interception harder, although we need to do that. I think we can do somewhat more on pressure on China to interrupt the flow of fentanyl precursors going to Mexico. We might be able to get Mexico to help a little more in cracking down on the labs there, but I think probably the area of vulnerability is the chemical companies in China that are selling the precursors. And then I think we have to do a better job, if you will, building immunity among young people, which means getting them through high school, giving them a job, giving them some purpose. But there are an awful lot of people without a lot of purpose. And so what do you do with them? And I think treatment is we tried a war on drugs, and that was not effective. But then we tried here in Oregon, we tried decriminalization, and that was not effective. And overdoses went up. And I think, as I look at it, I think that what we missed was just the overarching importance of getting people into treatment. And treatment is imperfect, doesn't work for everybody. They relapse, but low barriers to treatment. And so somebody can call up and, that moment they're ready for it. And instead of being told, oh, we've got a bed for you in 3 weeks, somebody says, look, okay, we'll send a van over to pick you up right now. And, can I bring my dog? Yes. My girlfriend? Yes, just try to get people in as quickly as possible. And you know, does that work? Well, not great, but it works better than other things that I've seen. And I think that in the U.S. we mistook Portugal as being about decriminalization, and I think that Portugal's success in was largely about improving treatment access.
Hmm. And I think they also, I've spent a little time researching Portugal. I think they also require you to go to treatment at a certain point, right? Don't you get like a warning and then you get a second warning and then the third time? Like, and this is for like public use and things, right? You get a ticket and then you go to court and then they can send you to treatment.
Yeah, they can. I mean, I must say the threat isn't all that great, but it is an inducement, and it's that's the point of it. It's really seen as a way to push people into treatment, and and that helps.
Hmm. So, all right. So I know I want to be mindful of your time here. We've been talking for about an hour. How are you on time?
I should. I've got a column that I've got to edit, so I should get off
Okay.
pretty soon.
Okay, so we're gonna all right, so we're gonna be at a natural wrapping point. All right, let me think about how to tie this up. Okay, so I know this is a topic that you're spending a lot of time on right now. What other issues are you spending time on? If people are going to read your column or follow your work, like what should we be anticipating in the coming months? What's calling to you these days in terms of, where do you want to shine a light?
So I mean, the two international issues think I'm most focused on are the Middle East and Sudan. And I will probably do trips to each place in the new year. And domestically, I want to write more about education, about these issues of addiction and this kind of working class realignment that we're seeing. If and I suppose a lot depends on what happens in the election. If Trump is elected, then I'll probably travel less over the next 4 years and spend more time in the U.S. Trying to cover that issue. But
Hmm.
so much happening in the world, so many. Actually, one other thing that has interested me is, I spent so much time over the last 25 years writing, or 30 years writing about gender. And it always used to be that gender meant women who were disadvantaged, didn't have the same opportunities. And there's still many ways in which that is true. And sexual violence is a huge global problem. But we're also seeing around the industrialized world that there is a problem with men and boys. And just as, when girls don't have opportunities, that hurts everybody. When boys don't have opportunities, that hurts everybody. And the, most striking, the gender gap in colleges is now greater than when Title IX was introduced, but it's the reverse. It's 60% female and 40% male. And, if we're going to have a healthy America, we've got to figure out how to get boys through high school, graduated, into jobs, into, some kind of a role with some sense of purpose and belonging. So that's an issue that intrigues me. I don't have any answers to that.
Yeah, that's something that intrigues me too. Um, there's essentially affirmative action for men now in a lot of the top
Yes, there
colleges,
is.
right? They're lower bar. It's sort of
Yes.
surreal. Yeah, there is some interesting stuff around gender because then you have the tops of most like the powerful positions are still very much dominated by men, but like the middle managers of America are primarily women. I think that in dual income households, there's like a very high percentage now of women out earning men, and it creates all kinds of insecurities and resentments that are coming out in weird ways, um, including in this election. So I'm trying to think of if there's anything we covered a lot. I think I we
We
really
solved
actually
many of
did
the world's
cover almost
problems.
everything I was hoping to. Are there any, the one question that I know you've already answered this a number of times, including in your book, but I think it would be a good way to end is like when you spend so much time. Okay, here I know how to frame this. So I have a lot of friends right now who are let me rephrase this. So I know a bunch of people right now are completely avoiding the news because they find it too depressing. And I think you have a belief that it's sort of our duty to, you know, bear witness to the tragedies of the world and to get involved and help. And I know you have this annual column of charities to give to. I'll link it in the show notes. Your one from last year, and I know that millions and millions of people read this, and millions of dollars have been donated because of your work. And I know overall you consider yourself an optimist. Is there
Yeah.
anything you can share with our listeners about how to bear witness to the tragedies and the evil in this world and still remain optimistic and sort of keep your sanity?
Yeah, people are always a little surprised at, the guy who covers war and genocide and addiction and human trafficking is fairly upbeat. And I think there are a couple of things going on. Um, One is that in the arc of my professional career, I've really seen huge progress. And in journalism, we don't write much about that progress. We cover planes that crash, not planes that take off. But there are a lot more planes that are taking off these days, and they're not crashing. And that's particularly true globally. So when I was born, 1/5 of all kids died before the age of 5. Now we're down to 3%. Every year it's going down. More kids are surviving. When I was a kid, a majority of human beings had always been illiterate. Now we're pushing 90% adult literacy. And there's been a particular revolution in female literacy around the world, which just transforms family dynamics, child raising, and so on. Every day, another 300,000 people emerge from extreme poverty. So there's a lot happening around the world that we need to bear in mind as well. And that, there's terrible things going on in plenty of places. We may be about to have one of the world's worst famines in Sudan, but that doesn't take away from the fact that we have figured out how to make real progress against disease, hunger, war, etc. And I think the other thing that I would say is that when you cover humanitarian crises, you see the worst of humanity, but side by side with the worst of humanity, you invariably find the best. And you see just, we're not tested in America, so we don't really know how we would respond. But I can tell you, when people are tested, they are capable of just tremendous courage and strength. And I, I was in rural Pakistan and met and wrote about this incredible woman called Mukhtar Mai, who had been sentenced by a village tribunal to be gang raped because of something that her brother supposedly had done. And then the tribunal carried that out. They gang raped her. And their expectation was that Mukhtar would kill herself out of shame. And instead, with the help of the local imam, she went to the police. She prosecuted her attacker. She sent them to prison. And then she used compensation money to start the first school in the village. And and then she enrolled the children of her attackers in that village. You just can't be in that village and not feel this awe, not just for Mukhtar herself, but at what we humans are capable of when tested. And I felt that a lot around the world. We screw up a lot. There are terrible things going on, but there's also an awful lot right going on that gives me the sense that if we truly tackle these challenges around us, we can make real headway.
What an amazing story to end on. Um, Thank you so much for joining Notes from the Front, Nick.
My
This
pleasure.
was really a pleasure speaking to you. I think we'll wrap there. Thank you again.
Great.